decarbonisation in this heavy industry. And you mentioned this stark number of zero allowances for 2039.
Yes.
Do you think this is feasible?
It's more than feasible, it's the law.
Okay.
This is the regulation right now. So the EU, the European Union, has as its goal, political goal, to reach net zero by 2045
Right.
or 2050. But in the sectors that are covered by the European Union emissions trading system, which are mostly power sectors and industry and manufacturing, the commitment is actually to get to zero by 2039. What that means is that by 2039, if you're a steel producer or a cement producer in Europe, you don't get any allowances. So if you are emitting any CO2, you will have to rely on essentially buying removal certificates that we still do not know where and how they will come from. So right now, it's not a given that these will be available. So that means that there's a huge pressure that is being felt across the continent for steel, for example, to decarbonize. That's why even at the levels of price that we're seeing, 70 euros a ton as of this morning, you have genuine large-scale projects that are aiming to get to zero CO2 steel, zero carbon steel being implemented, and these are already commercially viable projects. So that's the interesting thing, and that's what I was saying. 5 years ago, somebody called them hard to abate sectors. We're finding out they're not that actually hard to abate, they're just harder. Because we had seen what happened with electricity. We've decarbonized electricity, or we're in the process of decarbonizing electricity. Large-scale renewables rollout. People said, "Oh, transportation is terrible. We'll never get transportation off because you need, density in batteries. We need to have a huge hydrogen infrastructure with hydrogen gas stations, etc." Guess what? We now have 25% in this country. We have 25% of the new cars being sold are full battery electric, and you have places in Europe where nearly 90% of Sweden, 90% are battery electric. So we're starting to electrify transport way ahead of when people thought 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So transportation was hard to abate 5 years ago. Now steel is hard to abate. I can tell you that in 5 years' time, when we'll see, there's a gentleman here from a H2Green steel, we'll see that his project and his technology will become not exactly standard, obviously, because these are long-lived assets, but it will become not unusual, put it this way.
Is the industry really driving this process in the case of steel, for example?
Well, the industry is being driven to these processes. As in, I don't believe so much that the industry is of its own going to wake up one day and say, "Hey, let's decarbonize."
Yeah.
No, it's being pushed, and it's being pushed because there's a cost to still being emitting carbon in the next few years. The cost of a ton of carbon right now is 80 euros. You could bank on it being close to 100 in 2030, right? So if that becomes a real cost consideration for a steel producer, if your competitor down the street or in another part of the continent can produce with zero carbon, not paying those 100 euros, you're going to be out of business. And that's not out of business in 2050, you're going to be out of business in 2030.
Yeah.
So that accelerates the competitive drive, motivated by the fact that you are seeing a real cost to carbon. That accelerates a lot the change.
Who do you think are the key stakeholders involved in this process, apart from steel industry?
So this again, the harder to abate.
Yes.
Being steel is very complex. Cement is extremely complex. It's probably one of the most complex products because there's a lot of variability and the process itself is very hard. But everywhere where you have a manufacturing process or industrial process that is extremely energy intensive, where the density is really required. You want the typical example of a sector that will be truly hard to abate, aviation. Aviation is truly hard to abate. But guess what? Yes, they tell us aviation is really hard to abate, but yet there are now electric planes that do mid-haul flights, 50 to 100 kilometers with batteries. Just like you have cars, you have electric planes, and these are being sold commercially and for very niche applications. But that's how innovation works. You start off with the niche application. Your first mobile was for the very top level CEO. You had a car phone and it was bulky, and we all know 1970s, and we thought, oh God, now we have more technology in this than in a million of those phones, right? And everybody has them. So it's the same thing here. Yes, you're seeing ultra niche applications of electric aviation. The same way that we're seeing with shipping. We're starting with ferries. Here in Lisbon, some of the ferries are already electric, right?
Yeah.
Over time, you'll see that happening also in longer type of shipping. And you will see the need for large-scale hydrogen infrastructure, and not just hydrogen, ammonia, to fuel ships, like large container ships, etc. So there's a lot of innovation, but it's motivated, in my view, by the fact that we now have in various places a real horizon where we're planning to get to net zero.
Yeah. Large companies and SMEs are reacting to the situation or approaching
That really,
this?
I would say that really depends on the sector. On one hand, large companies, obviously by the fact that they're large, if they change, it's tremendous.
Yeah.
But we've seen, for example, oil and gas companies have, by and large, this is a huge characterization, by and large have been very reluctant to embrace, let's say, renewable energy. And they cling on to the e-fuels and some of these, which is only natural. It's preservation of their situation. But there are large companies, even in Europe, that were in the oil and gas business that have decided, for instance, to move entirely to biological biogas manufacturers. So we're talking Drax, for example, in the UK, and we're seeing some companies in oil and gas industry that have a clear view as to how they're going to move out of the pure oil and gas play, right? So they see themselves really as energy takers. In Portugal, without being too much of a promoter, you have the case of EDP. EDP was essentially a natural gas and coal producer 20 years ago, right? They were the mainstay of, ask any Portuguese, electricity is EDP, and they associated with gas and coal. Well, guess what? Now there is no coal. There's very little gas in Portugal right now. And EDP is a major renewable energy investor and producer, not just in Portugal, globally. It's one of the 10 largest renewable energy investors. So large companies, big differentiation. Same thing happened for SMEs. The SMEs have an advantage in that in many cases, in my view, the type of technologies that we are seeing advance in the energy transition are technologies that are very modular. But we don't have anymore the huge coal-fired power plants. We've got solar panels, and each company can have its solar panel.
Yeah.
And technologies are much more modular, so much more scalable. And so as you can scale up, you can also scale down. So a company can be an energy provider, an energy player, even though they're relatively small. And they can be quite profitable.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Muito obrigada, Pedro.